What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan and I am back with another true crime video. And in today's video, we're going to be speaking about the insanely brutal murder of 21-year-old Johnia Berry and how it's actually gone on to influence a lot of changes when it comes to DNA collection laws across the United States. Jonna was an outstanding young woman. She was a criminology major. She was also starting to study child psychology, and her goal was to make a difference in the world. And while this may not have been the difference that she had hoped, her death was absolutely not in vain, and it continues to impact victims of crime and victims' rights across the United States. Now, this case, on top of all of this, is also a little complicated because while the case is closed and technically considered solved, the person that was charged with her murder ended his own life before he made it to trial. So let's go ahead and just jump right on into the details. Jonna grew up with her siblings in Bristol, Tennessee. She was described by family as, quote, a vibrant beauty, very ambitious, with an endless supply of kindness and generosity. Jonna did not have a mean bone in her entire body. She was always so incredibly accepting and loving towards everyone around her. She always had a very large group of friends. She never had any enemies. She was also incredibly mature for her age, and she had always been that way since she was a very little girl. She maintained a level head in all situations, which is probably why she was so good at the career path that she ended up choosing. Jonna, on that note, was also wildly intelligent. At 21 years old, she graduated from the University of Tennessee. And after this, she decided she was not done yet. She wanted to study law. And her determination and her passion actually got her accepted as the youngest female ever at Thomas Cooley Law School in Michigan, which is absolutely insane and such a huge feat. And while attending school in Michigan, her life continued to just blossom right in front of her. She ended up meeting the man of her dreams, a young man named Jason White, who was also studying law in Michigan, and the couple absolutely hit it off. And after a period of dating, Jason ended up popping the question, and the couple excitedly looked forward to getting married, starting their life together. They had so many plans and hopes and dreams, but not before they finished working on their future careers. This was something that was incredibly important to the both of them. So at this point, while all of this was going on, Jonna made the realization that this was not what she wanted to be doing. According to what her dad has stated in an interview, she actually called him one day and was like, you know what? All lawyers do is read, and if this is what I have to do to be a lawyer, this is not how I want to spend my time. This is not what I want to do with the rest of my life. She just was not enjoying law school like she thought she would, so she made the really difficult decision to pursue another passion. But this passion was going to take her away from this new home she had in Michigan, from her new fiance, but this was something that she felt very strongly about, and that was working with kids. Jonna had loved kids her entire life. She always gravitated towards them. She was always the little caretaker, the little mama. So she made the decision to move back to Tennessee, to the area of Knoxville, to attend Tennessee University again, to get her master's in child psychology. While the move was definitely challenging, Jonna was hopeful and happy. I can't imagine what it must have felt like to have to move states away from a new fiance, a new life that you just started, new friends that you just made, but she knew that this was the right decision for her. Jason and Jonna kept in close contact. They spoke on the phone every single day, and they continued to plan their future. But unfortunately, that future would never happen because of the senseless acts of another human being. Jonna had moved back to Knoxville only 6 weeks prior to her death. Now, a friend of hers that she had made through her previous schooling, named Jason A. Mummy, had a great offer for Jonna that she simply could not pass up. Obviously, moving back to the area, she needed to find somewhere to live, and Jason and Jonna had known each other for quite some time. He actually not only went to school with her previously, but he also dated a good friend of hers. And when he heard that Jonna was coming back, he was like, look, I've got a 2-bedroom apartment off of Cedar Bluff Road in West Knoxville. I'm only using one of the bedrooms. I don't have a roommate, so if you want to move in here, this could be a perfect setup. You know, you'll have somewhere immediately to move into. This will be great. So Jonna took Jason up on this offer, having absolutely no idea, obviously, that this would be where an intruder would later take her life within just a few weeks. It was the early morning hours of December the 6th, 2004. A clerk at a nearby 7-Eleven gas station in western Knoxville was counting down the hours to the end of the night shift when suddenly complete chaos broke out. Just after 4 a.m., a man ran inside of the 7-Eleven, screaming, out of breath, and covered in blood. He was frantic, asking for someone to call 911, saying that he had been attacked, he had been hit, he had been stabbed, he needed help. And this man that ran into the 7-Eleven was Jason Amami.
Knox County 911.
There's a man that just walked in the store. He's heavily bloodied. Looks like he's been in a fight. His roommate's still in there. Apparently somebody broke into his house.
Is his roommate okay?
He doesn't know.
Okay, can I talk to him, please?
Sure. Sir, he wouldn't know.
We're both sleeping. I just felt somebody stab me right in my chest.
Somebody stabbed you?
And hit me in my face. And that's the first thing I did was get up and run.
Okay, what about your roommate?
She was screaming very loud.
Okay.
Didn't have any time. I just got out of there.
All right, what's your name?
Jason Amami.
Jason?
Amami.
Okay.
And I need an ambulance bad. I'm bleeding out here pretty bad.
9781. Client sponsors at his apartment in Park. His female roommate is still in 97th apartment. When she left, she was screaming.
Immediately, authorities were dispatched to the scene, and by 4:30 a.m., first responders had arrived to the apartment building, having no idea what they were about to stumble upon because Jason was just in this state of absolute shock. He didn't know who this attacker was. They didn't know if this attacker had just stayed to Jason and Jonna's apartment, if they had moved to anybody else. They didn't know the state they were going to find Jonna in. And once they were able to kind of gather themselves and get inside of the building, they were absolutely confronted with the most horrific and shocking scene. 21-year-old Johnia Berry was found mostly unresponsive, covered in blood, suffering from several stab wounds on the ground at the bottom of the stairs of the apartment building. It appeared as though she was trying to speak to officers, like she was trying to ask for help or tell them something, but she was unable to form any words at all. Authorities at this point wanted to quickly search the building to ensure that there was not an attacker still inside. They also wanted to make sure that there weren't any other victims as they waited for EMS to arrive. So they quickly left Jonna and made their way up the stairs to Jonna's apartment. The blood that covered all of the nearby doors, the walls, down the stairs, puzzled together for authorities the events that had taken place within the last 30 to 45 minutes. It was clear that both Jonna and Jason had desperately attempted to get help from neighbors. You could see handprints, bloody handprints on nearby doors where they clearly had been banging, asking for help, but unfortunately it seems like all of their pleas went completely unanswered. Jason obviously had run off, but somehow after Jonna pulled herself out of the apartment, knocked on multiple doors, she stumbled down the stairs where she had eventually collapsed. And as they entered the apartment, it was clear from the get-go that there had been a serious struggle. Just like the hallways leading down the stairs, the apartment was covered in blood, most of it coming from Jonna's room. Jonna had very clearly fought for her life based on the state her room was in. Things were tossed absolutely everywhere. Authorities continued to walk through the apartment. They were able to clear it. There were no other victims. The attacker was now gone. And so they immediately made their way back down to Jonna to comfort her just as EMS was arriving to whisk her away to the hospital. When Jonna was taken to the hospital, the brutality of this attack really came to light. It was very clear from the get-go how terrible things were, but really stopping, counting how many times she had been stabbed, taking the whole thing in was like a punch to the gut for everybody involved. Jonna had been stabbed 20 plus times all over her face and her upper body. And knowing that information and knowing that she still managed to get herself up out of her room, crawl out of her apartment, try to get help, and made it down a whole flight of stairs, there is not a doubt in my mind that she fought with everything she had to try to save herself and get away from whoever was attacking her. Now, despite desperate attempts from the medical staff at the UT hospital, Jonna was ultimately pronounced dead shortly after arriving. At 5 a.m., her parents received a phone call that changed their lives forever. Mike and Joan were told that Jonna, their daughter, had potentially been a stabbing victim that had succumbed to her injuries. And at this point, the hospital was not able to positively identify her. There was no ID that came in with her body. And so they said, we're pretty sure that's who we have based on witness statements based on the apartment, but we need family to come and ID her body. Jonna's parents lived, I believe, about 4 hours away in Georgia, so it was going to be a while before they could make it all the way to Knoxville. But it appears that most of Jonna's siblings either lived in Knoxville or still lived in the Tennessee area, so her parents then had to make the devastating call to her siblings, asking them if they would go to the hospital and ID this body. And the entire time, they were all hoping this is a misunderstanding. There's no way this is our Jonna. Nobody would have any reason to attack her. It doesn't make any sense. She doesn't have any enemies. She just moved to this area. But when Mike and Joan made it to the hospital and came face to face with their children devastatingly had to break the news that it was Jonna. Their loving, kind, driven, beautiful daughter and sister had been horrifically taken from them. Joan stated in an interview, quote, "I think the person that did this didn't just kill Jonna. He's killed a lot of people in our life." And as Jonna's family is grappling with this heavy loss, the police are now trying to figure out what on earth happened here? Who could have done this? And when you see a situation like this that appears to be overkill, is the term that's frequently used, it seems there's some passion behind it, like there is some sort of personal connection. But Jonna had absolutely no enemies. Like I've already stated, she had just moved to the area. I mean, it would seem kind of strange for this to be a random attack on her and Jason, but then they started to wonder, was Jason possibly involved? And then that led them to wonder if her fiance was possibly involved. None of this really made a lot of sense, and so they were trying to sift through all of these different possibilities. So obviously, authorities started at the scene of the crime. They wanted to gather as much forensic evidence as possible and details to see if this led them in any sort of direction. Now again, they were able to confirm for a fact there was no sign of forced entry throughout the entire home. There was no sign at the front door, the back door, the windows remained untampered with, and so this was very puzzling to them. This kind of indicates that either A, they left their doors unlocked for some reason, or B, this was potentially someone with a key or just someone that they trusted and let into the apartment. As they made their way through the apartment, they also put a lot of focus obviously on Jonna's room, and one really interesting piece of evidence that they found was an Atlanta Braves hat that was on Jonna's bed. And they believed this possibly had been worn by the attacker and had fallen off during the struggle. And another thing they unexpectedly ended up finding was what they believed to be the murder weapon. The living room of Jonna and Jason's apartment was a bent and bloody knife found in the middle of the floor. Upon further searches, it appeared that this knife also came from within the apartment. Having the murder weapon was massive because a lot of the time that's not the case, and this could hopefully provide them with some sort of DNA, and it was very obvious on the side of the knife, imprinted in blood that was very likely Jonna's, was a fingerprint. Authorities were incredibly hopeful that they would be able to identify this attacker relatively quickly. On top of this, they also managed to find a bloody shoe print in a mummy's room. So that's another big, huge identifying piece of evidence, and this was believed to be left by the attacker. If both Jason and Jonna were asleep when this happened, which was more than likely because it was in the dead middle of the night, the chances they had shoes on were slim to none. On top of that, there was an entire trail of blood leading out to the back door. On the back porch of the apartment, strewn everywhere, were bloody CDs. There was a blood-covered stereo that was found in a tree beside the apartment. So this was not a situation that they did not have any evidence. There was a lot of evidence that they were going to be able to sift through, and so far, from what they were gathering, it really did seem like whoever the attacker was, they knew Jonna or Jason. Police began to look into potential suspects, and obviously one of the very first ones they decided to look at was her fiance, Jason White. While the couple seemed to be in good standing, all of the people that they questioned said they were a great couple, they were incredibly happy. The recent move did raise a few eyebrows. Had something more been going on beneath the surface? Did they have a falling out? Was Jason White really okay with her moving all the way back to Knoxville? There were just a lot of potential questions, but they were able to very quickly speak to Jason White, and they ruled him out about as fast as they brought him up. Jason White's phone records were pulled, and they were able to confirm that he had been in Michigan the night of the attack. For just that, he had been on the phone with Jonna until about 11:30 p.m. Out of an overabundance of caution, authorities decided to just look into the possibility, like, could Jason White have ended this phone call at 11:30 and somehow made it all the way from Michigan to Knoxville, Tennessee by 4 a.m. for the attack? But obviously, when they started to try to add up all the time, they ultimately found that there was no possible way he could have done that. There was nothing at all suggesting that there was anything wrong with their relationship. And so someone else had to be responsible. And this led them to the next obvious person to look into and rule out, just from a standpoint of looking into everyone close to the crime. And that was Jason A. Mummy. Now, Jason had gone to the hospital after he called 911 to be treated for his wounds. He had several stab wounds all over his body. He was stabbed on his face. From what I've seen, it almost like ruptured his eye, his chest. He had a big injury on his hand. And when he was finally released from the hospital in about a day, he immediately came in to give his statement to authorities about what had happened. And authorities also took this as an opportunity to kind of question his story. So Jason told authorities his background. There are bits and pieces of the interview that you can find online. He had graduated from Eastern Tennessee State, just like Jonna. He confirmed they had a purely platonic relationship. They had always just been really good friends. And he said that that night had been just like any other. Jason said that Jonna went to her bedroom around 10:30 that night to settle in. And he stayed awake for a little while. And at around midnight to maybe 12:30 a.m., he headed to bed himself. And the next thing he knew, he was waking up to screams. Screaming seemed to be coming from Jonna's room. And initially, as he's kind of waking up and coming out of this groggy sleep, he believed that Jonna was just having a nightmare. It did not cross his mind that someone could potentially be in their apartment. He said that he remembered looking over at the clock and saw 4 a.m. and then he got up to go and check on Jonna and make sure she was all right. Jason said that he opened up the door to his bedroom, which was positioned right beside Jonna's door. So it was kind of like the very end of the hallway. It was Jonna's room, and then literally on the adjacent wall, that was his door. And when he opened his door, he was immediately met with an intruder. Jason said that the silhouette of a male was slowly backing out of Jonna's room, and he was standing there in just absolute shock, trying to assess what on earth was happening. And because of the proximity of their bedroom doors, Jason was stuck. He had absolutely nowhere to go. And as soon as this intruder met eyes with Jason, he immediately began to attack. Right away, the intruder grabbed Jason, pushed him into his bedroom, and threw him on the bed before repeatedly trying to stab him. Jason said that he fought relentlessly to try to stay out of the knife's path. At one point, even grabbing the knife with his bare hand to try to stop it from hitting him in any sort of incredibly sensitive and life-threatening places, and sliced open his fingers in the process. Now, ultimately, he was still stabbed a handful of times. He said that he was punched in the face, and all while this was happening, he just kept looking and hoping for a moment of opportunity where he would have a chance to break free. A clear shot to the door where he could throw this man off and get out of there. And when that moment came, Jason ran for his life. Jason said that he knew for a fact that the front door was locked to the apartment at the very least, because when he was trying to get out, that was the door that he ran to, and he had to unlock it in order to flee from the apartment. And I'm sure that in his mind, while all of this is going on, having to take the time to unlock the door felt like it took 30 minutes instead of the few extra seconds that it probably took. So that was something that was ingrained in his brain. From there, Jason said that he did in fact go to multiple different apartment doors and banged on the doors trying to get someone to help him. But when nobody answered, he realized he had to go somewhere else. He could not stay at the apartment building. So he ran a mile to this nearby 7-Eleven where he showed up and begged this clerk to call 911 for him. But this point, authorities knew, okay, the intruder did not get in through the front door. Jason's saying that it was locked, but what about the back door? Because there were no signs of forced entry there either. Now, Jason at this point said he couldn't say for sure. He said that he had not personally checked the back door that night, but Jonna was crazy about things like that. She took her safety very seriously, and he said it was like a ritual for her to walk around the apartment at night, make sure everything is locked up and good to go before she went to sleep. So if he had to bet on it, he would say that she had checked that door and that it was locked. Authorities decided to show him some of the different things that they had found within the apartment, like the hat that was on Jonna's bed, the CDs that were thrown all over the back porch, the stereo that was found nearby, all of these things that were covered in blood to see if they had been taken out of the apartment. Thinking maybe this was a burglary gone wrong, but Jason said that none of these things belonged to him, and from what he knew, they did not belong to Jonna either. So this kind of threw things off a little bit and made authorities question, why were these things there? If they didn't come from the apartment, why would an attacker bring them into the apartment? Just a lot of this was not really making any sense. At this point, Jason helped authorities create a sketch of the attacker. He was able to give a very, very good description, described this person as a man having short, dirty blonde hair, a squared off chin. And at this point, photos of this sketch were sent absolutely everywhere, hoping it would bring in tips. But despite the fact that Jason was a victim in this attack, he had been incredibly cooperative. He told them everything he could. Authorities looked at him as their very first suspect. Detectives had a lot of questions about his story and some of the evidence that they had gathered up to this point. First and foremost, they were really stuck on the fact that there was no sign of forced entry, and Jason seemed very sure that the apartment was all locked up when he went to bed. From what they were gathering, the only person with access to the apartment would have been Jason or Jonna. The alleged murder weapon was also from the apartment itself. And because this attack was so brutal, if this had been something that was possibly planned out by someone, they likely would have brought their own weapon. When you see someone take a weapon from an actual scene of the crime, usually it's because this crime was not premeditated, it was not thought out, and it was more of a spur of the moment situation, which it just wasn't necessarily seeming like that up to this point. So they were speculating essentially that Jason could be the attacker, that he had caused his own injuries to look like a victim in the crime. Despite claiming that he left through the front door, they believed that potentially this trail of blood leading out of the back door was actually him. That all of these random things that weren't making sense, like the hat and the CDs, the stereo, everything was just staged. On top of this odd evidence and information that seemed to not really be adding up, they also claimed that Jason's story had changed. When 911 was initially called, Jason is clearly heard saying that as he left the apartment, Jonna had been screaming, that he had to go, he couldn't stay, that he just ran and he could hear her screaming, but he knew he had to get help basically. But in his subsequent interview, when he was released from the hospital and authorities were able to speak to him, at this point, he claimed that he wasn't sure if Jonna was screaming or not. And authorities felt that if he had heard her screaming, that's something that he would remember, that someone would not simply forget which way it was. They also questioned the fact that he ran from the apartment at all, instead of trying to stay and help Jonna. And then came the attack itself. Jonna had been so brutally attacked, and Jason's injuries were definitely still terrible. They were nowhere near as severe as Jonna's, and the injury on his hand was of particular interest. While an injury like that can be like a defensive wound kind of injury, you get that from protecting yourself, which is what Jason claimed happened. You also can see an injury like that from the attacker themselves. When you, and this is going to be very graphic and not a great conversation coming up, so I'm just warning you now, you may want to skip ahead like 30 seconds to a minute. When an attacker is stabbing someone, first of all, it takes quite a bit of force to do it, at least a little more force than you would think it would. And there's a lot of spray from blood. And when that happens, the knife obviously gets covered in blood, but that also makes it very slippery. And so a lot of the time you will see that an attacker, their hand will actually slip on the knife as they are stabbing their victim. And when this happens, they can actually slice their fingers on the blade. And authorities, with this kind of theory that they're coming up with, they're thinking maybe that's what's actually happening here. Maybe this injury is not from him protecting himself, but actually from him slipping his hand down the knife as he was stabbing Jonna. But to this point, it seems they were keeping a lot of this information to themselves. 3 days after the brutal attack and murder, a funeral was held for Jonna, where everyone that loved her, cherished her, spent time with her, was able to come and say their goodbyes and pay their respects to her family. And she was peacefully laid to rest in her family cemetery. But there ended up being another sort of nagging situation even during this time, where everyone was supposed to be able to navigate their loss, kind of go through the motions of grieving and saying goodbye, because apparently Jason attended the funeral. Obviously, he was a good friend of hers. He also had been a victim in this attack. And according to a couple of articles that came out after the funeral, allegedly his behavior was not what some people expected. So he was described as being disconnected and nonchalant. And while all of this could very easily be chalked up to the fact that he had gone through some very, very serious trauma just days prior, this just added fuel to the fire that he was potentially involved. So on December 9th, he was brought back in by authorities. Now, this time, they wanted Jason to go back to the scene of the crime where he was attacked and Jonna was killed, to do a walkthrough. They wanted to basically have him describe the events of the night, basically reenact everything. And while they were definitely interested in more details so they could investigate further, they also seemed to be very carefully watching his behavior. And according to them, he lacked pretty much all emotion. Even as he laid in his own bed that he had been attacked in and reenacted this attack with an officer standing over him and like holding him, he showed no response. And again, while this could have been chalked up to the severe trauma, authorities believed that to them, this was his way of coping with what he had done. He had simply disconnected himself not to protect himself from what he had experienced, but to protect himself from what he was responsible for doing. But at this point, police had their hands tied. They had recovered plenty of forensic evidence throughout the entire scene of the crime. It had all been sent off for forensic testing, but from my understanding, the labs were incredibly backed up during this time, and so they knew it was going to be a couple of months before they received any sort of results back. While Jason was at the top of their list to continue to look into, they also wanted to look into other possibilities in case they had it wrong. Now, this ended up leading them to a man named Michael just 17 days after the murder. This man, Michael, lived about 3 miles away from Jonna and Jason. He had an outstanding warrant for completely unrelated charges. When he was picked up on that particular warrant, at this point, the sketch that had been made of the attacker, thanks to Jason, was circulating absolutely everywhere. Everyone in the community was keeping their eye out for someone that looked like this sketch. And this man, Michael, looked a heck of a lot like this sketch. When he was brought in again for this completely unrelated arrest, he ended up being questioned about the murder of Johnia Berry. As detectives are sitting him down, they're about to start asking him questions. They look down at his shoes because there was that shoe print found at the apartment. And lo and behold, they are like, oh my gosh, this is the smoking gun. The tread looks like it matches. We might have our guy. As they're thinking this, it goes another step further. Michael confesses that he knows a lot about the murder. Michael told detectives that he was in fact involved, or at least had knowledge when it came to the murder of Johnia Berry. And he was like, yeah, it was all drug related, which definitely sounded off, but authorities went with it. He claimed that Jason and Jonna owed money to a drug dealer that he was in cahoots with. And this drug dealer decided that in the early morning hours of December the 6th, he was going to go to Jason and Jonna's apartment to confront them about this money and collect it. And Michael claimed that he was the one who drove this drug dealer over to the apartment. Now, he claimed to sit in the car while the drug dealer went inside to collect this money. money. When it had been a while and this dealer friend of his had not come out of the apartment, he decided to go in and check that everything was okay. And he said that as he walked into the apartment, he personally witnessed this friend of his, this dealer, stabbing Jonna. Authorities could not believe what they were hearing, and they're thinking, this is it, we've finally got someone. But very quickly, this all fell apart. Authorities were trying to corroborate this man's story, and evidence just was not matching up. First of all, they took his shoe and they tried to compare it to the shoe print that had been left behind at the scene, and it was not a match. On top of that, there was just no other information that Michael could give that was making sense with anything that they were finding at the scene of the crime. It doesn't seem like he was giving over the name of this friend of his. And by the end of it all, they were able to find out that this was just a giant hoax. Essentially, Michael loved attention, and for one reason or another, he thought a great way to get it was to pretend to know information. Police were forced back to square one, except they still had a suspect that they were not ready to drop. As it rolled into the following year of 2005, they ended up asking Jason to come in for a polygraph, and he willingly agreed. Now, Jason was asked a handful of questions during this examination by the examiner, and as the test came to a close, instead of the examiner informing the detectives of the results, which is typically how it goes, the examiner instead looked Jason dead in the eye and straight up accused him of killing Jonna. Jason was completely taken aback. To me, it seems that this was the first time that he realized someone was looking at him as something other than a victim. He was like, what is going on here? I'm beginning to think that you guys are like believing I am responsible for this. He was very, very upset. And from my understanding, and I don't know for sure, I cannot say for a fact, I feel like this is not acceptable behavior. From my understanding, polygraph examiners, they administer these tests, but they're supposed to remain unbiased and like a third party, like this middle ground. They're not supposed to kind of lean one way or the other. I don't even think they're supposed to technically give results. I have never seen them give results to a person in any other case that I've covered. Typically, it's given to authorities and they decide what to do with it. And so this was just totally out of pocket. And obviously, authorities saw this and thought the same because they immediately shut this down and they were like, oh no, we got a big problem and we've got to deal with this. And so at this point, they decided instead of putting Jason through another polygraph, which at this point he probably was not going to take, they decided to just have another examiner look at the test results from the first test. And interestingly, this examiner said there was nothing on there that made them feel he was being deceptive. He had passed the polygraph. But again, despite all of this, authorities still zeroed in on Jason. They were not going to let this go. And at this point, they also were just kind of outright accusing him like the examiner had, at least according to statements that Jason has since come forward and made. Apparently, they started to accuse him of using drugs. They said that somehow his drug use was tied into whatever happened. He also said that investigators were so set on that they went to do more searches of his belongings and like all of his new furniture and things that he had after the attack. They came and they cut all of it up. They destroyed all of it. And they were essentially looking for evidence of drugs and money, saying that that had something to do with it. They were accusing him of being jealous of Jason White and wanting to have a relationship with Jonna. There was just a whole lot that they were saying to him as their reasoning behind why they believed he was potentially responsible. And they told Jason that he was going to go down for what happened to Jonna. And they were so certain that all of that forensic evidence and testing that came back was going to point directly to Jason. So it was a shock when that didn't happen at all. When the DNA test came back, it was found, obviously, that Jonna's blood was on the murder weapon, along with other evidence taken. There was also Jason A. Mummy's blood, which would make sense since he had been repeatedly stabbed with that same knife. But there was a third DNA profile, and it was from an unidentified male. And the fingerprint that had been made on the murder weapon was made in Jonna's blood, and it was again from an unidentified person. So Jason had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. I understand that they believe that some of the evidence felt off, but man, I feel so awful for him. There's a reason why certain people are ruled out first, but man, when it's wrong and they go real hard on it, it's really wrong. And I feel so awful for Jason. This just kind of goes to show too, and it's like a prime example that everyone reacts differently. A lot of the speculation against Jason was from expecting him to act a certain way. From her funeral that he attended to the walkthrough at the apartment, it all seemed off, according to authorities, according to other onlookers, but things are not always linear. And I feel like we all need to just remember that, myself included, that sometimes you just don't know how someone's going to act, and their behavior is not always a blaring red flag that they are somehow responsible. And interestingly, I tried to look into the psychology of this all because I'm just wildly fascinated with things like this. And psychologists that have looked into his behavior have spoken up and essentially said he was literally just in shock. Like he had gone through such severe trauma. He was coping whatever way he could to make it through the day. Understandably, at this point, Jason did not want to speak to anyone about what had happened, okay? I mean, that's just trauma on top of trauma. He had a lot that he needed to heal from and go through. And so he moved away from Tennessee. The public still at this point was pointing at him, saying that he was fleeing. Some people still believed he was responsible, despite the fact that he was completely ruled out. And he remained silent for a very long time. And he eventually did come forward and make a few statements saying that he just could not bear to be in that area anymore after what had happened. And after he was cleared, he had to move on with his life. He had to move forward. This really did put authorities all the way back at square one. Every other circumstance, they always fell back on Jason. But now he had been ruled out. They had nobody. But they at least had DNA and a fingerprint, and that's massive. And so the first thing they decided to do was run this DNA through different databases to see if there was a hit. And they were crossing their fingers, but there wasn't one. And so the search continued. Over 1,000 tests had been done at this point in connection to the case, according to Mark Gwynn, who was the director of the TBI at the moment. They were sending in DNA samples and comparison samples from everyone possible. People that knew Jonna, people that lived nearby, making this forensic investigation like the largest in the history of the TBI at this point. A reward was also put up, hoping that this would bring forward tips. It was slowly increasing, and I believe the largest that it got was $70,000. At least that's the largest that I have found. And everyone in the community was doing whatever they could to keep Jonna's name out there. They didn't want anyone to forget, because this person was still out there on the loose, and after seeing what they could do to someone, potentially a complete stranger, who knew if they would continue on and do this to somebody else? Jonna's mother, Joan, also made it a point to come to Knoxville whenever she possibly could. Whenever she would have a day off in Georgia, she would pack up her car, drive all the way, 4 hours away to Knoxville, to pass out flyers, to put them up in new places, to talk to people in the area, make sure people knew about Jonna's case, make sure that photographs of the sketch were out everywhere, hoping that the right person would see this information, or she would talk to someone who maybe didn't know that Jonna had been murdered, and maybe that this would be just the right person that would lead to an arrest. Grocery chains in the area also began to put Jonna's face and her photo, the photos of the sketch, everything on the side of their big box trucks. Again, they were hoping that these trucks traveling down the highway would put new eyes on the case. Billboards were put up as well along the different highways in hopes to elicit tips, and it ended up working. And you guys, this just goes to show you can't stop trying. Keep the billboards up, even if it's years later, even if it's in the location where the crime occurred and you think that everyone knows, somehow there's always someone who's not heard of what's happened. 3 years after Jonna's murder and the weekend of her parents' anniversary, they were spending time together and they got another unexpected phone call. There was a potential suspect, and this time it was looking really promising. So sometime in early 2007, a call had come in from a concerned citizen who it appears lived in the area and just so happened to pass by a local billboard. And in all these 3 years, despite, I believe, again, living in the area, they had not seen any of the posters or the billboards or the box trucks or anything that was out there for Jonna, any of the news coverage. And as they're looking at this billboard, they notice the sketch of the alleged perpetrator. And right away, they're like, I recognize that person. And so they called into authorities and said, hey, that person on the sketch, that person on your billboard is 22-year-old Taylor Lee Olsen. So authorities began to immediately look into Olsen and found that he had been living relatively close to Jonna, like I believe just a couple miles away, had a lengthy criminal history. And there was an in to question him. He currently had an outstanding warrant due to a probation violation. And so he was arrested and brought in, and while incarcerated for this unrelated offense, they took advantage of the situation to question him about Jonna's murder. Olsen right away denied any involvement whatsoever. I don't know if he even acknowledged the fact that he knew that she had been murdered or had seen any of the billboards or the posters, the news coverage, and he was ultimately released. But not before submitting his DNA. Once they obtained Olsen's DNA, they quickly sent it off to be compared to the DNA sample that was found at the scene of the crime. And just as before, they were told, we're backed up, it's gonna be a while. So at this point, they are just sitting on the edge of their seats. They've been working relentlessly to solve this case, and it took until September of 2007 for the results to come back. The DNA from Taylor Olsen and the unidentified male at the murder scene were a match, and the fingerprint that had been made into Jonna's blood on the knife was also a match. Taylor Olsen had to be their guy. Right away, detectives were scrambling to try to throw together evidence to build a case, and after taking the forensic findings to a grand jury, confident that they had finally found the right person, they ended up getting the green light to proceed with charges. And so on September 24th, 2007, Taylor Olsen was arrested in a mall parking lot and brought in to be specifically, this time, questioned about the attack on Jason and the murder of Johnia Berry. Now, Taylor, pretty much right away, from what I have seen, was confronted with the fact that he was forensically tied to the crime. Detectives told Taylor they had DNA on the murder weapon, his fingerprint on the murder weapon. His DNA was actually in a few different places of the apartment, I believe. And initially, Olsen claimed he was being pranked. When he was told this, he was like laughing and he was like, oh, you're joking with me, right? Obviously, authorities were not. And when he realized this was serious, he continued to say, nope, I know nothing about it. I was not involved. Olsen was questioned a handful of times over the next couple of days, each time becoming more and more distressed and remaining very adamant that he was not involved. But eventually, he ended up cracking and he confessed. Olsen told detectives that he was living in an apartment down the street with a friend of his named Noah Cox. And he said that they decided that their entertainment for that night, December 5th into December 6th, was to break into cars, get high, guzzle some stolen beer. That was their idea of a good night. And so after a while of these nefarious activities, they had tried to get into a handful of different cars. They ended up, I guess, getting caught at a nearby apartment complex. Someone came out of their apartment, started yelling at them, and he claimed that he and his friend Noah split up, and he believed that Noah had gone home. But Taylor Olsen was not ready to end the night yet. He told detectives that he wanted to steal a car. And so his plans were to go around and check nearby apartments to see if they were unlocked so that he could hopefully find a set of keys, set off a car alarm, quickly locate the car, hop in, and take it home. This is when he stumbled across the unlocked back door of Jonna and Jason's apartment. So despite the fact that Jonna constantly was checking to make sure all the doors are locked, this is like one of the few nights that for some reason that didn't happen. And so Taylor Olsen was able to gain very easy access to the apartment, obviously leaving no trace of forced entry. He told detectives that he proceeded to use the light from his cell phone to make his way through the apartment. He thought that he was being quiet, but he said that he very quickly realized that he had woken someone up. From bits and pieces of interviews that I've been able to listen to and read transcripts from, when it comes to Taylor Olsen describing what happened. Essentially, it seems like he was claiming that Jonna must have kept a knife in her room, and when she heard him in the house, she came out to defend herself and try to get him to leave. And he's claiming that it was dark, he couldn't see what was going on, and he just got into a struggle with someone, and he doesn't remember stabbing anyone, but he does remember that he was stabbed and that he ran out of the apartment as fast as he possibly could, saying, quote, "It didn't seem like I stabbed anybody. It seemed like a fight or something, and then I just ran." So while he admitted to being in Jonna's apartment and getting into an altercation with her, I guess, he would not admit to the fact that he had stabbed her 20 plus times, and the evidence shows that's exactly what ended up happening. He was asked if anyone else was in the apartment with him, maybe someone else could have potentially played a part in this. He said, quote, no one was with me, before ending this interview by saying, quote, "I can't believe this happened." Now, Olsen was given a moment to speak to his family after this point before his formal arrest, and all the wheels started to get into motion. And in this recording, it's very interesting because he seems very visibly upset and confused. He was telling his mother and another family member pretty much the same things that he had told authorities, that he remembered struggling with someone, but he didn't remember stabbing anyone. And he kept saying, "I would never do that to somebody. Why would I have done that?" Family just kept saying, "Well, why did you confess?" And he'd be like, "Well, they said my blood was on the knife, so I must have." And so this caused a lot of kind of speculation in terms of what may have happened, if he was actually responsible. Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser actually ended up looking into this and the fact that he did genuinely seem confused and like he didn't remember. And she said that it is her personal belief that he knew exactly what he did, that this was all one big show, essentially. Him saying, "I don't remember, I wouldn't do that to someone." All of that was him pretending to have no idea and make himself look innocent and devastated, hoping that it would in some way help him in the long run. He was already tied to this crime heavily by forensics, and so the one thing that he could potentially lean on to attempt to get out of this, or at least an easier way out, would be by saying, "I don't remember any of it." Olsen was ultimately charged with first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, felony murder, and aggravated burglary, and he was held on $1 million bond. And another very memorable moment in all of this that had people scratching their heads again when it comes to kind of his reaction to this news and the confession that he gave was when he was transported to wait for trial. Now, these are like one of the most common videos you'll see out there after someone's arrest, him being escorted out to a car, in cuffs, being put in, and there's always dozens of reporters there waiting to ask all these questions. And most of the time, the person that's been charged with the crime does not say a word. They give no reaction. There's not even any facial expression. Taylor Olsen did the complete opposite. The moment he walked out, he said, quote, "I'm sorry, I never meant for this to happen. It was an accident." Again, kind of leaning into this idea that he had no idea what had happened and that he was just told he did it, and so he was accepting it. And when reporters asked him, how on earth is stabbing someone 20 plus times an accident, the look on Taylor's face is one that looks like genuine shock. Like he had absolutely no idea that she had been stabbed so many times. Like he was hearing it for the first time. This was surprising information, which again played into this idea that he didn't know what he had done. Just after being thrown in jail, honestly, to no surprise, Olsen ended up recanting his confession. He seemed to not just recant his confession, but he pointed the finger at someone else. He said that he knew there was another person responsible, but this person was not released. There was no talk from Olsen's attorney about this, and for a lot of people, this was just kind of dismissed as a desperate attempt to escape his reality, which it appeared he had been doing since he initially confessed to authorities. I can only imagine how this all must have made Jonna's family feel. To watch all of this unfold before them, to hear that Olsen's confessing, but he's also trying to say he doesn't remember what happened, and then he's saying that he didn't even participate at all. But they were so thankful that there had finally been an arrest. Olsen's trial was set for July 28th, 2008. That was going to be heartbreaking for Jonna's family to have to sit there and relive everything that had happened to her, but also one that they were anxiously awaiting. Joan had kept a journal this entire time of all the questions that she wanted to ask the person who took her daughter away from her. And this was going to be a moment to ask those questions. Try to grasp how someone could do this to her little girl. Finally have a moment to directly address the person that did this. But that moment would never come. On March 24th, 2008, just months before his trial was set to begin, Taylor Olsen was found dead in his cell. He had ended his own life. Jonna's family would never get answers from him. Jonna would never get full justice. With that, the case was closed. Mike Berry ended up coming forward, Jonna's father, and stated that even though there was no conviction and they could not, with absolute certainty at least, legal terms, be able to state that Taylor Olsen was responsible, that, quote, "That's what I call the coward's admission of guilt." To Jonna's family, if he had not been responsible, why would he have done what he did? Based on the evidence that was obtained, the Berry family said that they strongly felt they had had the right person. And if this had gone on to trial like it was supposed to, they strongly believed Olsen would have been found guilty. A lot of attention seemed to kind of gather around Olsen's death and if he was in fact responsible. And even more so when it was found through court records released after Olsen's death that the defense had actually planned that their approach for the trial was to claim another man had been responsible, and not just any man, they had the name of someone. A 9-page handwritten letter had been found in Taylor's cell. This letter is titled "The Story." In this letter, Taylor claims that he did not break into the apartment by himself. Information about this handwritten letter circulated the media like crazy, and his attorney ended up speaking about it and said that the entire time he had been representing Taylor Olsen, that Taylor was adamant that someone else had been responsible for the crime. And while initially they were not releasing the name of this person, eventually it was released, and it was Noah Cox, the roommate and the other person that Taylor Olsen had been with the night of Jonna's murder. The story, as it was titled, claimed that there was in fact still a struggle between Olsen and Jonna. He still said that he went into the apartment, just that Noah was with him. And when he got in there, he was confronted by Jonna. And when Noah heard the noise, Noah essentially came in. He was the one who killed her. It said in the letter, quote, "Noah heard the rumble and ran in to help me. I ran out the back and just ran. He killed that girl." On top of this 9-page letter, there were numerous other letters that were found within his cell after his death. And these letters were written to his attorney, to his family members, saying, quote, "I am no murderer. I was not there when anyone was harmed." And these letters were kind of revealed by his attorney, Gregory Isaacs, who said that the letters contained sympathy that Taylor felt for the Berry family. All of this being released and there still being these looming questions, this gathered a lot of attention. Olsen continued to speak out after this, remaining adamant that his client was not guilty, that he was not responsible for the death of Jonna. And he even said that there was another person, a witness, that could corroborate this, someone that Noah Cox had confessed to. This statement came from 23-year-old Augustine Leon. And his statement lined up perfectly with everything that Taylor had said in the story and all of the other letters that were found within his cell. And the reason that this didn't seem far-fetched and people weren't immediately dismissing this, despite the fact that there was so much forensic evidence pointing directly towards Taylor, is because authorities had actually questioned Noah in connection to the murder before they even knew about Taylor Olsen. So this Noah Cox name was not even anything new to police. Apparently, just 22 days after the murder, something ended up leading authorities to Noah Cox, and he was questioned by detectives. Noah had a long criminal history. Again, he lived relatively close, and when authorities spoke to him, he stated that he was actually passed out drunk in his apartment at the time of the murders. He didn't have any kind of physical evidence on his person that suggested that he had been in a recent struggle with anyone. He was checked for stab wounds, scratches, bruises. There was none of that. So they ultimately let him go. Now that all of this was brought up again, prosecutors and detectives were like, okay, we'd already questioned this guy. Now he's being brought up again. We have evidence that the person he was with that night was in the apartment. Was he maybe there too? Jason ended up being shown photos of both Taylor and Noah to see if he could pick one out, but ultimately he was not able to say for sure either way. And so really, this was just kind of a big disaster. Even the assistant district attorney, Kevin Allen, voiced his concern. And it was in regards to the investigation into Taylor, the different times they had questioned Noah, and why he felt that potentially Noah could have been there. Apparently the CDs, the hat, and the stereo that had been found at the apartment, they were able to identify that these items belonged to one of Jonna and Jason's neighbors. And this neighbor stated that that night of the 5th into the 6th, his car had been broken into right outside of those apartments in the parking lot, and those were the things that had been taken. However, there was not just one hat taken, there were 2 hats. So everything that was taken from his car was found except for this one hat. And so this led to a handful of different questions. Only one hat was found on Jonna's bed, and they had already believed that this hat had come off during the attack. And this car had to have been broken into pretty much right before Jonna and Jason's apartment was broken into. And so despite the fact that Taylor had said initially that he was alone at this point, that he got separated from Noah, authorities began to wonder, okay, well, where'd the second hat go? Was there a second person there to wear it right outside of Jonna's apartment, and then maybe they left, or did this person come in the apartment as well? Kevin Allen also said that during all of the times that Noah was questioned, after Taylor was arrested, he seemed particularly hung up on the hat that was found in the apartment, this Atlanta Braves hat on the bed, and he kept insisting that he never wore it. But Noah was adamant that Taylor had worn it. So again, he kind of placed himself there by saying, oh no, he definitely wore that hat. So obviously he was there by the apartment complex when this hat was stolen from the car just prior to Jonna's murder. And apparently every time detectives would try to move past this point, go past this hat that was found, Noah would repeatedly come back to this piece of information. And he even offered to give a hair sample to rule himself out as being in the apartment, to say that hat is not mine, you can test it, take my hair sample, you won't find my DNA in there. And DA Kevin Allen said that Noah even called after giving this hair sample multiple times to see if there were any results that had come back yet. At one point, he even called back frantic, saying that he actually had tried the hat on, that while he initially didn't remember ever wearing it, that he did try it on real quick before giving it back to Taylor, and so now he was worried that his DNA might be on it. But ultimately, while this all does seem a little bit odd and maybe could be strange behavior again, there was zero evidence ever found suggesting that Noah was ever at the apartment, that he ever went inside. They did in fact take his hair, they tested it to DNA found on the hat. The only DNA found on the hat was from the original owner. The only evidence that they did have pointed towards Taylor. So if Noah had been there and was responsible, like Taylor was trying to claim prior to his death, like the attorney was still stating, he would have somehow had to do all of this, including be the main aggressor in the attack against both Jonna and Jason, and somehow not left a single shred of forensic evidence behind. On top of that, when authorities were digging into all of this speculation, they were able to speak to 2 different individuals that admitted to working with Taylor in order to set Noah up. Authorities assured the community, despite all of this, that they had done everything they possibly could, that they were confident, fully confident in the arrest that they made, the investigation that they performed, and they fully felt that Taylor Olsen had been the sole person responsible. And Jonna's family seemed to fully back this statement. Once all of this passed, all of this speculation died down, Jonna's family put every ounce of effort into lobbying for change. Now, this even started prior to an arrest even being made. And it seemed to stem from the fact that they had DNA for years and were not able to match it to anyone. On May 9th, 2007, the Johnia Berry Act passed in Tennessee. And the Johnia Berry Act essentially states that a person that is arrested for a violent felony is required to have DNA taken. Now, there had already been legislation in place that required convicted felons to provide DNA, but the Berry family felt that this was allowing a lot of potentially dangerous people to slip through the cracks. What about those that are charged with a violent felony and for one reason or another are let go? And while some of those cases are people that have been wrongfully accused, wrongfully charged, a lot of them just got really, really lucky. And they have a high chance at that point, now that they were able to walk in jail and walk right back out, of being a repeat offender. Because it's not every day that you just, casually get charged with a violent felony, unless there's something pretty serious leading to those charges. And with this kind of history, Jonna's family strongly felt that those even arrested for these violent crimes should have to submit DNA. So far, 29 states have taken up similar arrestee DNA laws across the United States. It does not seem like it kind of took over by storm. It's been a slow trickle thing, and I think that's because there's a lot of controversy around it and the legality of it, and a lot of people believe it goes against constitutional rights. However, the few times that it has been challenged, the Supreme Court has withheld the law, and they said there's no constitutional conflict here whatsoever. This was a massive, massive movement for Jonna's family, and this is something that they have been incredibly proud of, that they have been able to help accomplish, because this could make all of the difference for families out there waiting for answers as to what happened to their loved one. When I was researching this, I also came across an unsettling article, a more recent one from 2021 with Jonna's family, where they were speaking about all of the work that they put into passing Johnia Berry's Act and the way that it could benefit the community, but how unfortunately it seems there is just a big overall misunderstanding and breakdown when it comes to DNA collection, specifically in the state of Tennessee. And unfortunately, due to further research I have done, it looks like it stems a lot further than that. It's in other states as well. Now, when this particular law passed, it seems like there is no good way for all of the different agencies and entities out there to be on the same page. And there's like thousands and thousands of DNA samples in Tennessee that have just gone missing. I don't know how that happens, but they're literally just gone. And it's creating all of these cracks in what was supposed to be an incredibly helpful piece of legislation. And when I kind of took a dive deeper into all of this, journalists have gone around and questioned numerous different organizations, facilities, you name it, around the state of Tennessee. And it's very obvious that there is confusion. Some jails that were questioned stated that they were supposed to obtain the DNA sample, and others said, no, we're not supposed to do it. That's actually up to the arresting officer. But then when that was checked into, from what I have seen, legally, the DNA sample cannot be taken under this act until after arraignment. And so at that point, the arresting officer is long gone. And so you've got all of these different people assuming someone else is doing what they're supposed to be doing. And unfortunately, certain things are just not getting done. One sheriff was even questioned, and he said he assumed that his deputies were taking samples, but he couldn't even say for sure. And this is why I have focused so heavily on these different cases that have inspired change, that, where new laws have come forward, because it never just stops there. These cases are real. They happen to real people. These laws go into effect, and they affect the entire community. They change the landscape for victims and for families, and it does not all just stop. This isn't the end of a book. This is an ongoing fight that I just want to make sure that we are all aware of. True crime, when you're consuming it in the form of a YouTube video or on TV or whatever, it can seem very open and shut. Jonna's fight is not over. Her family's fight is not over, and they are still pushing to make sure that these gaps and these holes in the system continue to be filled in, so that their legislation that they worked so hard for can benefit everyone the way that they had originally hoped. But this isn't the only way that Jonna's legacy lives on. Her family created an organization called Hope for Victims, and the organization essentially provides a safe space for victims, families, friends, anyone dealing with violent crime and needing to just discuss it, or have someone to sit and listen to them. Support and communication, resources, guidance. This organization works really hard to increase public awareness on these issues as well. They obviously advocate for DNA collection, all in hopes to make a safer world. You can donate to Hope for Victims in honor of Jonna to help support other victims. They also hold a toy drive every holiday season. So if you're local to the Knoxville area of Tennessee, they usually announce places where you can bring the toys. If you are not, since we are watching on YouTube and all of us are from many different places around the world, keep an eye on their website that I have linked down below. They usually give a PayPal option so you can donate and they will get toys on your behalf. This is an incredibly devastating story, and this young woman was taken away from so many people, and the amount of good that she could have done in this world is just absolutely wild. Jonna planned to dedicate her entire life to defending others, and so she deserves that in return. And so if you take anything away from this video, I really hope that it encourages you to become involved in victims advocacy laws in your area, or at least become more informed. Just see what's happening in your area. See if there's other families that potentially need some help, a little bit of support. If there's just something small you can do to try to make a change, to make things different for victims and families of victims through a process that at times seems impossible to navigate, that is always, always a plus. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to Jonna and Jason's story. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.